All right, everybody, welcome. So tonight we have Will Arnold joining us. Will Arnold received his MFA in photography from the University of Illinois at the Urbana-Champaign and his BA in computer science from Bucknell University. He currently lives and works in Champaign, Illinois, where he manages the student labs at U of I, at the School of Art and Design there. And Will co-runs Work Press and Publication, a risograph-based zine and artist book self-publishing venture. Will is also a part of the organizing teams for the Champaign-Urbana Small Press Fest and the St. Louis Independent Comics Expo. In recent years, Will's practice has primarily focused on zines, comics, and artist books. And through photography, collage, and delving into remixing historical comics, he explores themes such as landscape, epistemology, memory, and the construction of gender norms. Everybody, please welcome Will Arnold. Hey.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Will.
Thank you. Okay, let's see now if I can share
Spotlight you.
screen correctly. All right, got that. And then make sure that's all right. You guys still seeing the full screen? Yeah, there we go. Okay, hide that. All right, yeah. So thank you for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to come and hang out and chat. So, yeah, without going through all of that again, I will kind of touch on each of those areas a little bit in this talk. So, yeah, founder or co-founder of WordPress and Publication, um, working at the U of I School of Art and Design, and then organizing a couple of shows. So tonight I'm going to touch on each of those topics a little bit, and kind of start with a little bit about how and why I got into self-publishing as a practice, and then talk about a little of how my work has come along through that over the years, and a little about my process, and show some examples of the work, obviously. Um, I can, there we go. All right, so just to give you a quick look at the sort of general aesthetic of where my work is now, these are just a couple of slides of some pages from a book, a few prints, and a table of my work. Um, that is my wife, Robin, who often comes with me to shows and is incredibly helpful and much more friendly and outgoing than me, and so allows me to be sociable and meet people at these things when I'd rather just sit quietly behind the table and not talk to anybody. Um, so basically, my work now in general manifests as risograph prints and zines, typically of collaged vintage comic book artwork. Um, but before I get kind of back to that and where I am now, I'm going to just jump back a little bit, because my background is actually in photography, and that is how I ultimately got into zines and self-publishing, was through that. So back when I was in grad school in 2009 to 2012, I was making, large format landscape photographs, and putting them on gallery walls like you do with that sort of thing. But since, making large prints, mounting them, framing them, the production costs of all that are very expensive. And therefore, if you were to sell any of the work, you would have to price it fairly expensively. I would often make zines that people could take away from shows. And so these would function kind of like catalogs of the work, but also would sort of be not like a formal catalog, but they would just be a little art object in and of themselves. And I liked that, the people around me, who were also in grad school and broke, could take a little piece of art away, for, no cost, and could, remember my work by having that on their bookshelves, and just have something to take away for their collection. And that practice was really inspired by the printmaker Amos Paul Kennedy Jr., who came and visited the U of I while I was there. And he said basically something along those same lines that really stuck with me. So I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's a letterpress printer, and he prints, these text-based things on chipboard, just kind of small, tabloid if-ish size cheap chipboard. And so someone asked him while he was there, he said, like, you're pretty well known, you're showing in big galleries all over the world. Galleries and collectors and people would be willing to pay a lot more for your work because he would sell these prints for like 20 bucks a piece. Why don't you price these higher? And his answer was basically, at the time his studio was down in rural Alabama. And he was like, my friends, the people I know, and the people in my social circles, they couldn't afford to spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on a piece of art. And neither could he. And so he was like, but they could afford 20 bucks. And so he wanted to make his work accessible. He wanted to get it out into the world and have it be out in people's hands and people experiencing it that way. So that is the idea of cheap art, and that is what drove me ultimately into self-publishing and zines and that whole kind of market and environment. So this is the Cheap Art Manifesto. This is a print made by the Bread and Puppet Theater back in the 80s that kind of sums up their idea of cheap art. And it's basically, the idea that art should be a part of everyday life. It shouldn't be relegated to museums and galleries and people with the money to have expensive collections. It should be out there in the world, living and breathing and being experienced by people. So the thing, whenever I talk about cheap art, that I always want to make very clear is that what cheap art does not mean, it does not mean that artists or designers should undervalue their work or undervalue their labor, and undercut themselves or undersell themselves. Um, but it means that it is art that is produced intentionally in a way that allows it to be distributed inexpensively. So it was an intentional decision by the artist or the maker to make their work in a way that allows them to make it available for a low price, even if people would be willing to pay more for it. So Amos Paul Kennedy is a good example. Choices like printing on chipboard as opposed to expensive archival papers, or using letterpress, which can be a very very cheap per print method of printing, allows him to produce his art inexpensively, and therefore he can distribute it inexpensively. So that brings me to Riso printing, because Riso printing also serves that same function of being able to reduce work very inexpensively. So WordPress and publication is kind of a joint venture between myself and Tate Foley, who is a printmaker in St. Louis at Webster University. And we've known each other for a very long time, and we make very different work. And so WordPress is just kind of a joint name that we use together for the kind of publishing aspects of our creative practices. And, given that we make very different work, and although we have done a few collaborative things in the past, like basically we have two separate practices, both publishing using the name WordPress and distributing under WordPress. I don't know if that really makes any sense, but, art is always more fun with friends. And so it's kind of just nice to have someone else to be able to talk about things with, and to be able to sort of be in it together with, even if we're each just kind of doing our own thing. Brief history of WordPress. Basically, in January of 2012, Tate had heard of risographs and finds one nearby on Craigslist and gets it and starts experimenting with it. And at that point, I'm in the middle of putting together my MFA thesis, writing my thesis, and putting together a show. And so I have no idea. I'm too busy to notice what he's doing, but he starts experimenting on it. And so in fall of 2012, I go down to St. Louis for a collaborative show that he and I were doing. And he shows me the printer, and he's like, this is really fun. This cool new process that, I'm just figuring out. Like, you should bring some photos down and we should make some, something with it. So we officially founded WordPress then in 2013. So I don't know that I need to define this for anybody here, given that you guys just hosted Risorama and have Risos there and are probably familiar with it. But, Japanese digital duplicator, stencil-based printer, descendant of the mimeograph, prints images one color at a time, or two if you're fancy. And then you can layer your images and build them. So it sits in this nice, Venn diagram between, analog and digital print production. Um, in a lot of audiences, I usually have to define what this is for people. So, but pretty sure you all are familiar. Um, so this book, from where we began, it was my first foray into reso printing. Um, and I was still figuring out a lot about color separations and how the different colors blended together and stuff. And so it was kind of an experiment with, taking my full color photographs and figuring out how to mix them down to two channels to make these duotone images, and then playing with different combinations of red and blue, orange and green, with the different drums that Tate had, to see what sorts of prints that I could make. And this was really exciting for me because after I had finished grad school, I spent about a year or so basically not making anything. I was like super burnt out, was not sure where I wanted to go, or what I wanted to do with any of that. And jumping into this and learning this new process and this new medium, really re-energized me and got me back into making new work at all. So, in 2014 was the first time that WorkPress tabled at any sort of show. So we were at the first St. Louis Small Press Expo, um, at Firecracker Press in St. Louis. And again, this was like a huge turning point in my art practice. It was the most fun I had had at an art event in a long time. And though I had seen people making artist books and handmade books and zines and other kinds of things before, I had never seen like this many people all gathered in one place, all making these zines and artist books and comics and all this kind of stuff together. And just, a huge diversity of content and huge diversity of people, but all tied together by this, print format. Um, and going back to that idea of cheap art, I loved that there was this huge emphasis in this community on affordable and accessible art. Like, I think the most expensive thing in the whole show might have been like $20 or something. So people were trading zines, they were, selling them for $5. Everyone was just super generous, super happy to be there, very excited about the whole thing, both the artists who were showing their work and, all the people who came in, some of whom just wandered in off the streets and had no idea what was going on. And then we're kind of excited that, like, I mean, I literally remember having a conversation with the woman who was just like, I would never thought of myself as an art collector or anything. Didn't think I could afford to be someone who collected art, but like I'm here and I'm like seeing all this cool stuff and it's like $5 and $10 and I can buy it and take it home with me. Um, so inspired by all of that, I decided that like this was it. This is what I was going to be doing. This is my primary method of making work going forward. So over the next year or so, I made several more books, driving down to St. Louis every time I had enough work to print. But that was starting to get cumbersome. And so after a little while, I started monitoring Craigslists all over the Midwest and eventually found a $150 machine from a skating rink in Kentucky that was closing down. So called them up, said, I'll be there in 6 hours, hold that for me, and drove straight down, picked it up, and drove straight back. And it's kind of harder to get that kind of deal now, but they do still exist. One of our grad students who's just graduating this year, he just got a couple of Risos for like $200 from a place in Cincinnati, and one was broken, but he got two of them and he has now extra parts for the other one. So you can still find those kind of deals occasionally. But in general, people kind of know what Risos are worth now and that there is higher demand. Um, so now that I own the means of production, I was able to start printing, much more regularly because I could just wander out to my studio on Saturday morning and start working. So this was the first book I made on my own printer. It's called Wanderers, and it consists of photos taken by me on July 14th, 2015, and photos taken at the same time on the same day by the New Horizons space probe as it was flying by Pluto, billions of miles away. So we were in LA that day and everybody was freaking out and like the traffic up to the Griffith Observatory was crazy. And we were like, what the heck? Why is everybody going up to the observatory? And yeah, it's because the Pluto flyby was happening. And everyone was freaking out about it. It was pretty cool. Um, so part of the joy of working with the RISO and really any kind of process-based medium is working within the limitations of the medium and seeing where those limitations take you. So at the time when I was making this book, I only had access to blue and black drums. And so, it forced me to make some decisions. So this book was a combination of the blue and black Riso printing with full color laser prints for some of those kind of full color photos that you can see, mixing in, choosing colored papers for some pages, and even on the cover of the book there, using a highlighter to like highlight in just that little yellow bit on the boat that I wanted to have lit up. Um, so it's kind of part of the fun of just figuring out what are the limitations of the medium that you're working with and how can those force you down, different decision paths when you're making a piece of work. So at this point, I'm now again like fully bought into the small press self-publishing lifestyle. Like I said, I own the means of production and I start doing as many zine fests and shows as I can. Um, You may note bottom right is Chicago Art Book Fair 2018. And sorry, it's not a great picture, but you can see Dimitri in the corner there next to me. That is where we met as table neighbors there. Um, and so just started traveling all over the place and doing sort of as many of these kinds of shows as possible. So in the process of doing that, I was seeing tons of people making independent comics and illustration work at these places because the kind of zine format is a sort of natural fit for people making comics, that aren't being published obviously by like big publishers. Um, so that really, as a photographer, that re-sparked my interest in comics that I'd had as a kid, as a book form outside of photo books. And so I wanted to work with comics. Seeing all these people doing really cool things just made me feel that urge to like make some comics. But I'm not an illustrator. And so my entry into the field of working with comics ended up being through taking scans of historical comics. Started off with ones that I could find in public domain databases online, and later led to me going out and actually buying physical comics and scanning them in myself, and then doing various kind of remixes and interventions and collages with those books. Um, so these are a few examples of some of those that I made over the course of a few years. So Captain Romance / Girls in Science. That's one book front and back. You flip it over and read one story to the middle, and then flip it over and read the other one. And that takes a romance comic and a old sci-fi comic and swaps the text and images between the two. So you get the space guys with the romance dialogue and the romance characters with the sci-fi dialogue. And similarly, Tom Corbett Love Cadet. The orange one with the orange cover down there takes an advice column from a 60s romance comic and sets it to illustrations from an old golden age Tom Corbett Space Cadet comics. And then Boys in Love, which I did a few issues of, takes again kind of 50s 60s romance comics and it swaps the male and female dialogue to make a new story where the gender roles are reversed. And so each of these in their own different ways was kind of examining the history of how media and pop culture, particularly comics, portrays men and women and their relationships and, what happens when you kind of switch those things around and how that reveals both the oddities of those dynamics historically, but also how much is still kind of has not progressed as far as you might think even in modern times. So over those years too, I also had the pleasure of doing some collaborative printing projects with other artists. This has never been the main thrust of my publishing practice, simply due to time constraints. Since I work a full-time job, all of my studio time is, nights and weekends. And after I spend the time I want on my own projects, I don't have a ton of time left over to be doing commission printing or working with other people. But every time I get the opportunity to, I do always feel like I learn something new from it. Just when you're working with someone else's vision and someone else's imagery, you learn new technical things as you're trying to achieve a certain effect or blend certain, pairs of colors. And you just kind of, it can break you out of the rut of that you can get in working in your own art where can get so, define yourself down into a very specific aesthetic. So quickly, these projects, the Famous Monsters by Maria Lux was a comic that she made. She was doing a gallery exhibition about endlings, which are the last surviving specimen of endangered species, and reimagining them as zombies, kind of that they're walking dead because they lack the ability to reproduce and continue the species, and they're these tragic figures. So a part of that exhibition was making this comic that had a narrative and tied in with the show. Then the middle book with Paul Short, who now has his own thriving Risograph publishing practice. At the time, he was still getting his studio set up. And if you've ever been to any art book fairs anywhere in the country, you've probably met Paul Short because I think he goes to every single show ever. But he was doing a book about signs about art practices, art galleries, and museums. And then on the right is Sophie McMahon, who goes by Dreaming of Johnny online, and she's a local artist here in Urbana who does these really awesome comics inspired by vintage horror and romance comics. And she's actually the one who introduced me to the whole genre of mid-century romance comics by giving me a whole stack years ago, which has very much influenced where the content of my work has gone. So she is the one exception I make for the I don't typically print for other people, both because I'm a huge fan of her work and I feel like I owe her a debt. But I just love getting to work with her imagery as well. So that kind of brings me up to basically where my practice is now and the type of work that I'm making. So I kind of want to talk through here now a little bit about the type of images that I'm making now, how I generate those, and how they make their way into prints and books. So by late 2019 or early 2020, I was starting to make physical cut and paste collages in addition to the kind of previous books I showed that were these kind of digital remixes of vintage comics. I had been, as we traveled for shows, we'd go to comic book stores, and I had been just like amassing lots of cheap reader grade comics for source material, looking for new stuff to scan and to use. Um, and so it just made sense to kind of start cutting them up and playing around with them in this way. And then, of course, no surprise, the pandemic hit in early 2020, and all of the book shows were canceled. Um, and the one very, very small silver lining in all of that was that now I suddenly had a lot of time at home and no deadlines for new books. I didn't need to get new work out before the next whatever show. So it really let me delve into making these kind of individual images that had no pressure of ending up in a book or being a part of any sort of larger project. And so it kind of gave me the space to experiment a little bit more and try some different things, and especially with this physical collage, which is really what I started doing a lot of at that time. So since then, that process of that analog collage process has really kind of become my sketchbook. It's how I generate ideas and new images, and frequently those things that start off as individual collages will ultimately make their way into books in one way or another. Now, a couple of things that I like about the collage process. Part of it is just that, as I mentioned earlier, not being an illustrator, I I think I'm a better editor than I am a creator from nothing. And so with collage and also, with photography, as I was doing before, you never have to start with a blank page. With photography, you start with something that is existing in the real world, and then you can start framing it and contextualizing it and making an image of it. Um, and with collage, you obviously have the pieces that you're starting with. And so you always have something to build off of. Um, and so what I really like too is that the act of production of collages, the act of creating art, and the act of appreciating the source material and consuming the source material are one and the same. So basically, it's an excuse for me to go out and buy comics and to read a bunch of old comics, and it gives me a direction in that practice rather than just amassing all of these books. But I love that, yeah, I can sit down and make work, and at the same time, I'm learning about this historical work and like just learning more about the breadth of it and discovering the different artists who are producing it and all that kind of stuff. So that creating and appreciating happening simultaneously. Um, and then also, it forces me not to exert too much control over where the work might go or where a story might go, because you're constrained by the material you're working with. So it necessarily shapes the kind of meanings and the outcomes that I end up with. Because again, much like working with a riso with only a couple drums, you have to work within the limitations of your materials. So that sets up all kinds of boundaries that then you can sort of bounce off of and come across creative ideas by, pushing against those boundaries of the source material that's in front of you. So in addition to that physical cut and paste of collage, I will often also digitally collage things. So this is just an example of that, where it's actually on the left and in the center, two analog collages, two separate, physical cut and paste collages, that then I scanned and layered digitally, and then modified from there to, kind of add more layers of complexity, more kind of collaging of the collage. Um, and this is a process that then has shown up a lot in my work over the last few years. So there we go. Ultimately, then, a lot of these images make their way to become risograph prints, either as individual, just single sheet prints, or as pages in a book or a zine. So just to talk a little bit about the technical process of how that happens, this is an example. So on the left, I've got the original, again, cut and paste collage of vintage comic books. So it's scanned in, and in Photoshop, I use several adjustment tools to basically separate out as best I can the black line work of the image. Then I will go in and recolor digitally, all those color flats that you can see next to it there in the middle. Um, so I've basically assembled a palette of digital CMY based colors that don't have any black in them. They're just CMY that I have kind of tested and figured out over time match up well with my yellow, fluorescent pink, and aqua Riso inks that I can kind of reproduce that four color CMYK process. So the final digital version doesn't look exactly like, the Riso print is going to, but it allows me to at least kind of have a good estimate and have some control over like exactly how I'm blending the colors. Um, so then, I can just separate out those CMY channels in Photoshop, print them out again using those yellow, flow pink, and aqua, and then put that black line work layer on top to have the full color Riso image like you see on the right. So this is just a quick little video showing the layering of those Riso colors and how they build up into the full color image with the yellow, the aqua, the pink, and then the black on top. And I really enjoy this process, specifically for the content of my work, because it sort of echoes and references that traditional four-color offset printing process that older pre-digital comics would have used. So again, back before it was all digital illustration or digital coloring in comics, which transitioned, kind of sometime in the 90s. they would all be made with these color flats, cut out of halftone screen sheets, printed in the CMY, or actually they would often use red instead of magenta, and sometimes more of a blue instead of cyan, but essentially the same kind of three-color process. And then the black inked line work would be layered on top. So I like how that the Riso printing process is, again, in a sort of semi-digital, semi-analog way, sort of referencing back to the way that the source material would have been originally printed. Nope, nope, I wanted to go. There we go. Okay, so this book, Tears of Light, is an example of how that collage sketching process can sometimes grow into a book. So these images started off without any sort of book in mind. I was basically just, making collages over the course of a couple of weeks, and I was working through this stack of books from this 80s manga series, and they're all black and white, and they're full of these beautiful landscape images. Um, and there's obviously like a storyline and things are happening, but there are lots of these very empty landscapes or just these images with just these kind of natural things and animals and trees. And so I was taking these out and using them as the base backgrounds for things, and then collaging colored bits from different comics, different genres of comics on top of them. By the time I had like 10 or 12 of these, I was just like looking at them laid out on the table and was like, oh shoot, these could all be a thing together somehow. Um, so I was just like, oh, well, if I can just figure out a sort of sequence and progression for these, and then maybe make a few more images to kind of bridge some gaps and tie some things together and make some through lines, this could become a book. And so that's exactly what I did. And so it ended up being this sort of very loosely narrative, kind of dream-like progression. I think of it more like a progression than a narrative. There's not necessarily a story that's happening, but there is action moving forward throughout it. And again, all just based on these kind of one-off images. And so that is sort of the way that sometimes these ideas can just bubble up out of, just the act of making without, any particular goal in mind. And in this, it was the same process that I was just showing in terms of translating it to the book, where the collages were scanned and then recolored digitally with that CMY palette and then printed in the 4-color process on the Riso. And then the last of my work that I'll show here, this was a more recent series. And these are based on a set of T.S. Eliot poems by the same name, the Four Quartets. And so each book takes one of the Eliot poems as a kind of starting point for themes and structures, and then collages bits of the poem's text together with like a wide variety of comic book sources, to make the sort of new, again, very kind of loosely semi-narrative, poetic comics out of that existing source material. And with these, I really liked how there were these through lines of melodrama and things happening between all of the sources. So you get the really like overplayed emotions of some of the romance comics. And then you mix in some real cosmic melodrama of Silver Surfer floating through space, having existential crisis after existential crisis, and kind of agonizing over it as he floats around through space. And then combined with, the sort of heavy poetic language of Eliot talking about time and memory and all this stuff. And I just really liked how these very disparate sources had these, relationships and through lines together. And so one thing that was really important for me in the making of this series was that every bit within it needed to be like authentic from the vintage comic book source material. So as opposed to some of the earlier comics or the interventions where I was just sort of typing things up, like the text up in a comic looking font and not worrying too much about that, here I actually like pulled every letter from scans and reset all the text like one letter at a time. Um, and I've since actually created some of my own fonts using the scan text that I've made so that I can actually go back and type things a little easier, and not to spend all the time of setting every letter in the book one letter at a time. But at the time, that's what I was doing for this. So every line, every little bit of anything in this book was, authentically sourced from a comic that I scanned. And there was mixes in here of scans of physical collages that I made, as well as digital layouts and panels put together, and digital combinations of those physical collages. So all the different processes that I've kind of shown here, coming together and weaving in and out in these books. Um, so as one last example of that, this is an example of these two pages. One from Superman, one from the back of a Star Wars, the kind of pinup pages in the back of a Star Wars Marvel comic, um, combined together to make this layout for a page in the book. So taking the layout of the Superman, taking that one word bubble, modifying the text in it just a little bit, but using some of it, and then bringing in that kind of background from the Star Wars kind of galactic space background thing happening to make this page in the book. Okay. So now changing lanes a little bit, from my work to then some of the other aspects of my practice working with other people. Um, so another really important aspect of my practice for me is sharing small press and zines and the whole concept of that, and kind of evangelizing self-publishing as a medium. So as we mentioned at the start, my day job is managing the labs at the University of Illinois School of Art and Design. And I'm very lucky that there I also get to work directly with students and faculty on reso printing and zine making, just yeah, as a part of my day job there at the school. So back in 2017, I proposed to the school that we should get a reso because that's what all the cool kids were doing. Um, and they approved it and gave me some money. And so since then, I've been able to work with our faculty in like printmaking and the design disciplines and some of the other studio art disciplines, like photography and others, to integrate reso printing and self-publishing into their curriculums. So I really enjoy getting to work with students and introduce them to it. And then, even though I'm not directly teaching, I mean, I'll come in and give workshops and talks and classes and stuff, but I'm not teaching my own classes, but I get to have some of those, like proud teacher moments when I see our students graduate and, go off and like keep making zines and going to zine shows and finding their own resos and doing things like that. So I really enjoy getting to spread the self-publishing love that way through the school. And then I also try to get out into the broader community with this. So for a while now, I've been helping out with organizing the CU Small Press Fest here in Champaign, Urbana, and basically connected with some other folks on campus at the university library, and some folks from like engineering and some of the sciences that used zines in their teaching practices, um, and have kind of put together a show that we put on every other year here in Champaign, Urbana. Um, so it actually started because Sarah Christensen, who's from the University Library, who's in the yellow pants holding a bag there, um, she was like auditing a book arts class years ago at Art and Design, and I came in and gave a talk on Riso and zines, and she got really into them. And then like a year later, she approached me and was like, "Hey, what if we, did a whole show here and like kept this going?" Um, and at the time I was traveling all over doing zine shows and art book fairs and small press expos and stuff all over the place. And so it was really exciting to be like, oh, I could try to bring some of this back to the cornfields of central Illinois and try to like do some of it here in town, which has been really rewarding and very fun. So we're now in the process of organizing our fourth show, again every other year. Um, and that includes, bringing in guest lecturers. We've done several gallery exhibitions of zines, workshops, presentations by local makers, live printing, and like an actual zine fest day where we have people come in and table their work. And then also in the last couple of years, I've been a part of the organizing team for Slice, the St. Louis Independent Comics Expo. So Slice was formerly the St. Louis Small Press Expo, which was that very first show that Tate and I ever did as Work Press. And so we did that show every year until COVID hit and they, went on hiatus with everyone else in the world. And so it's always had a very special place in my heart. So it's felt like the hometown show for me, even though it's 3 hours away in St. Louis. Um, so in 2023, there was a group of new organizers trying to bring it back post COVID. And so I took that opportunity to jump on board and get involved with helping organize it. So at that time, they rebranded as Slice, and it is now going into its third year this fall. So we did 23, 24, and we're in the process of planning 25. Um, and with this, it's just like, it's pretty incredible how much you can accomplish with even just a handful of people, like all working together toward a common goal to build a community like this. In a way that I would never be able to organize a full zine show, on my own. But even with just like 7 or 8 people and some volunteers, like you can really make big things happen, which has been super exciting to be a part of. Um, almost here at the end. To wrap things up, I kind of have 3 thoughts or pieces of advice or whatever for things that I feel like have helped me have a sustainable practice for like 12 years now that I've been doing this publishing as my creative practice. And so the first thing is in relation to Small Press Fest or Slice here is to find your community of people or build it if you have to. Um, as I mentioned earlier, I am not a naturally outgoing person. And like all the socializing involved in these zine shows tends to make me very uncomfortable. But I also recognize that when I push myself out of my comfort zone and just do these things, good things tend to happen. So I've met tons of wonderful people at these shows, both people who have become, professional colleagues and acquaintances, and people who have become good friends. And so I feel like both, my life and my art practice are better off for getting out of my studio and out into the world, even though that would not be my natural mode of operation. So yeah, the advice there is, go to shows, talk to people, even if it makes you uncomfortable. And obviously this applies to other things if you're not going into self-publishing or whatever, or this exact circuit of things, like, be out there and be a part of the community that you want to be in. And you never know who you're going to meet and run into at these things. And whether they'll invite you to give a talk at their class in a couple years. Um, the second thing is to always be reinvesting into your practice, however that means. And I think this can look very different depending on your financial situation and where your practice fits in with that. So for me, I decided early on that I never wanted to try to make a living off of my art practice. I'm a pretty risk-averse person, and the thought of the pressure of having to try to make a living off of my work, I think would have taken all the joy out of it. And I didn't want that kind of pressure to shape the type of work that I was making. So for me, my definition of whether my practice is being successful is whether it is kind of financially self-sustaining. So I want to generate enough income from my art and creative services work that I can continue making the work I want to do and doing the shows that I want to do without dipping into my day job income. So the money I make from my day job, I live off of. The money I make from selling my art or creative services goes back into the tools and materials and expenses for the production of more work. So that means, keeping separate bank accounts for the two. And the benefit of that and the freedom of that is that because I don't have to worry about paying bills with any of that art money, I can reinvest it back into the studio and back into my practice. So like, yes, it buys me more paper and ink and comic books to cut up to make the next project. But, it also over time has allowed me to buy the larger collection of drums. So I have access to more colors. allows me to get a flat file so I can store my work better and build shelves in my studio so I can keep everything organized. It allows me to get a good computer that can run, my super high res scans and giant files in Photoshop and a scanner so I can do all my scanning at home and I don't have to haul everything into the school and use the school scanners. Um, and all of these things, a nice office chair that so my 40-year-old back doesn't hurt when I like sit for hours on end working on something. Um, so all these things in my studio, pictured here, where I am also currently standing, um, I didn't outfit that whole studio all at once. That was a process of 10 years of gradually investing in getting new things and making the space and equipment work for me. But then that investment it compounds upon itself because, owning the means of production means you can produce more work and you can produce that work easier, more efficiently. And that efficiency frees you up to then experiment and try new things and come up with new ideas. So the fact that I don't have to drive to St. Louis to print anymore means I can just print much more frequently whenever I need to, and so it allows me to kind of make more and try more new things. But again, that was all built up very gradually over time. And then the one kind of side luxury I allow myself with that art money and when I have excess is to buy art from other artists, especially when I'm at these shows. So that's fun because it expands my collection and I like getting to experience that and read other people's work. And it also gives me, of course, inspiration and ideas, the ability to study what other people are doing and have that inform my practice and my techniques and my work. Um, but then importantly, I also feel like it is a small bit of kind of reinvesting money back into the art community that I want to be a part of. So if I want to go to these shows and sell my books, I want other people to be selling their books at these shows. And so if I can contribute to that a little bit by buying it, buying work from people, then great. And then lastly, the last little piece of advice is to like just keep working. Just keep doing whatever it is you're trying to do. So the name Work, Press, and Publication came from Sister Karita Kent's 10 Rules from Immaculate Heart Art Department. So if you're familiar with those, Rule 7 is the only rule is work. If you work, it will lead to things or lead to something. It's the people who do all of the work all of the time who eventually catch on to things. So that's kind of always been my philosophy with art making is that you just have to keep working and keep making, even when you don't feel like it, even when you're feeling out of place at a show or your sales aren't great. Um, if it's something you want to be doing, just keep doing it. And, I firmly believe that like good ideas and good artwork comes out of all the piles of bad ideas and bad art that you have to kind of make in order to get through them and set aside and then come up with the thing that you're really wanting to be doing. Um, so that is everything. Thank you. And I will stop sharing. And if anyone has any questions, we can talk about questions.
Thank you so much, Will. What do you guys have any questions for Will while he's still here?
I was gonna ask more about the science girls in science
Mhm.
slash comic. The how the process of swapping the text was that what was that like? Does it just naturally flow or did you have to kind of rewrite the stories?
So I had to massage it a little bit. I didn't typically rewrite things other than occasionally changing pronouns or things like that to make it, make sense. But it was a lot of like, I couldn't necessarily do one to one, like the first panel and the first panel get swapped and the second panel, like, so it was like I found the series of panels that I could still kind of piece together so it would still be a story, but then sort of make sense with it. So, they are still, a little bit absurdist in that like it doesn't quite always track. But I did try to make it so that it wasn't completely absurdist, that you could actually read it and the words would make sense with the images, even though there was sometimes, things that kind of clashed or didn't quite go. So yeah, it wasn't the stories ended up being shorter than the originals because I would basically weed out bits that I didn't want or that didn't quite fit and put it back together. So yeah, not a one for one, but it was like everything there did exist in the original comics on both sides, just kind of figuring out how to repiece that together.
I noticed I was on your site and I noticed you did an ad too. It was like the bodybuilding ad, like don't be skinny or
Yeah.
whatever, and you repurposed that.
Yeah, those were AI. So I did a pair of like you're too heavy and you're too skinny. And so both the posters can go side by side so that, it doesn't, the important thing is that no matter what your body type is, it's wrong. And you should do something about it.
I appreciated the section where you actually showed the color separation, how you did that, because that was a question as I was looking at the work. How is this done? And then you went ahead and answered it. And I had this flashback to the 90s when in Image Comics that when they were moving towards computer to the new way, you were talking about it. And I remember it's because I saw this ad, it was like in an Image comic and it said computer color separators, top rates paid. And it kind of, I was like, oh, maybe I could do that. Maybe that's a job I could do. Anyway, I appreciated you showing that process. That was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean the printmaking process. So in addition to photography, printmaking was something I did a fair amount of back in school. And so any of those kind of I don't know. I like to like, get nerdy and figure out like the ins and outs of those little process-based medium. But yeah, there's some really wild stuff in the like late 80s and 90s as that transition was happening, especially just the way they like advertise. Like there's like a Batman graphic novel called Batman Digital Justice, that was like I think it was either very late 80s or very early 90s, and it's all like pixel based, very like early Tron looking like types of stuff. And a lot of those comics were very heavily like, yeah, we're using computers now to make art. Can you believe it? Yeah. Any other questions?
I think, well, thanks again. I mean, I think it was really, really cool how you dived into, especially the comics. Um, I too, the 90s, I got into them quite a bit. I guess my question to you is, at least when I was into the comics, and I've been trying to get back into it. Back in the day, it was all about the artist, right? Whether the artist came out on Levi's jeans commercial, or they were, doing the Spideys and the McFarlane kind of wave came through an Image and all that. Do you feel, and just looking at the stuff that you're doing with the comic book style, do you feel that this would be a great time for comic books to take a step back and really explore the production side? Now that I mean, there's some good artists now, but is there a way to bring in independent publishing and the style that you're doing with Risograph into creating? Because the stuff that you're doing is pretty dynamic. Because they're all about being polished, in my opinion.
Mhm.
But I think comic books, what I liked about them was there was always some sort of finding the mistakes within the print or finding the mistakes within the design or the art was always fascinating to me because it made it a little bit more human. It wasn't like, oh, there was a big gap from an artist standpoint. So I'm wondering if you have anyone who's spoken to you, or if you ever thought of that this medium, the risograph, being more of a driving component for comic books.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really has been in the like small press comics and like kind of independent comics makers making stuff. So I feel like the where Riso really exploded in that whole scene was that it allowed those kind of independent makers to bring color into their work in a way that like if you look at zines from all the way up to like the 90s or something, they're largely black and white, just because color printing processes are so expensive. And the Riso really brought in color, and so I think that's why there has been a huge explosion of Riso printing in that kind of independent and small press comics world. And I think you do see it bleeding into some of the kind of small to medium presses. You know, you have places like Silver Sprocket or like Uncivilized Books or some of these other kind of small comics producers who they're legit publishers and they make, you know, legit very nice hardcover comic books and things like that, graphic novels and things, but they will also support doing, you know, independent makers doing you know, reso zines, and they go to a lot of these shows and do those things. And I think you see even that bubbling up into some of the bigger ones like Drawn and Quarterly or Fantagraphics or things where they're collecting these books that have been made previously by, you know, people kind of independently, and now they're getting sort of collected into, you know, and published more, you know, in more the independent mainstream or mainstream independent publishers like that. Um, and just yeah, on that note, yeah, I think that comics has always been um the medium has always been like a team effort and a kind of production thing, you know, because like yes, you had the main artist who, depending on the situation, might have been the person doing the pencils for the comic or the person inking the comic. And you would have a separate person doing color and a separate person setting text. And you'd have these teams of people, you know, working together on these things. Um, and that's changed a lot over the years, right? Like the I feel like the 90s and the image um the explosion of image was very much like we are these individual artists doing the thing, and they still had colorists and they still had the other technical people, but like it was very much about the person and the author. But like if you just go back before that to the kind of silver age, bronze age, like 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, which is a lot of actually the material that what I'm using. There are, I mean, depending on the publisher, there are times when the artists are not even named, you know, or maybe not even allowed to sign the work, that they were literally just, you know, commercial production artists. Um, and, you know, a lot of those kind of genre comics that were not like your Marvel DC, but that were just the like Westerns or horror or romance, that were more episodic, and not character driven, like, you know, the superhero comics were, um, would often be pretty could often be pretty anonymous. I mean, and you had your big names, you had your like Jack Kirby's and, you know, Steve Ditko's and these people who came up and out of those worlds and were had really identifiable styles, but then you just had a lot of just people who this was just their day job, was just, you know, making these things. So I don't know. I think I kind of got off on a tangent there, but yeah, I mean, I do feel like I see some of that, the explosion in the last kind of 15 years or so of the independent comics has been seeping into the mainstream more and more, to the point where now in like I can go into my little comic book shop here in Champaign, Urbana, which is just sadly just a sad little comic shop that does not have much at all. But they will occasionally have like, you know, super independent stuff from like Silver Sprocket or one of those, that like even some of these independent presses are able to get in with the big distributors and then get out to the local comic book stores. So I think there is a little bit of blending in that, and some seeping in and breaking in to the mainstream. But yeah, I think that's always been a kind of dynamic in the comics industry. Just the changing kind of norms and preferences about prizing like the publisher or the story or the artist or the writer or whatever, depending on the case.
All right. You guys good? Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate you sharing your work with us.
Yeah,
Um,
thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
you did say a couple of years. I think it's been 7 years, which is kind of dark, but
Yeah, quite a few years.
goes by. So, but it's great to see you, and thanks so much for, yeah, again, it's just like I really love seeing all your work. Yeah, stay in touch. We'll share some of the outcomes from this class so you can kind of get a feel for, you've shared your work. We'll share some of ours
Yeah,
when it's all made and stuff. So,
yeah,
yeah.
I'd love to see it.
So, all right. Thank you.
Awesome. Have a good night, everybody.
I gotta stop recording.